Welcome back to our yearly roundup of all the weird news that's happened in 2022. I'm back today with 2 more weird tales from the year just past. However, this won't be your usual news roundup. This is strictly the stuff that makes you go, what? As quite frankly, the regular news is far too depressing. So instead, we'll be exploring a few weird and wonderful stories that may have not made it into the regular newspaper. Now, that's not to say that these stories don't sometimes dally with the dark side, because they most definitely do, but we'll mainly be focusing on the light-hearted strange side of things. But if anything's going to be a bit too heavy, I'll give you a heads up first. So with the disclaimer out of the way, let's jump in to March. But before we do that, if you are new around here, then hi, my name's Nikki, and I make podcasts, videos and TikToks about all sorts of weird stuff. So if you're into that, which I have a sneaking suspicion you might be, then please hit subscribe so we can hang out together again. And if you're not new here, then welcome back, old fiend. Nice to see you again. Scotland has a huge history of paganism and witchcraft. The country, which has as much folklore wafting through it as one of Stevie Nicks' shawls, has a long history of persecution towards witches, much like many countries around the world. What with the resurgence of witchcraft over the past decade and the acceptance that the executions carried out were nothing more than thinly veiled misogyny, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, made an appeal that those tried and executed under the Witchcraft Act of 1563 receive an official pardon. But why is such a historic thing such an issue in the modern day? Surely something which happened in 1563 isn't an issue nowadays and can surely be chalked up to experience and, essentially, forgotten. Well, as it turns out, things are a little more complicated than that. Between the mid-1500s and the repeal of the Witchcraft Act in 1736, approximately 4,000 people were tried and over 200 people executed for crimes of witchcraft, mainly in the Scottish borders. These cases were predominantly women that were executed, and the ingrained misogyny these long-forgotten executions hold is something Scotland would rather set right. Here's Nicola Sturgeon's speech she made on International Women's Day about the trials.
And of course, the lives of women are still blighted each and every day by an epidemic of harassment, abuse, threats and violence. An epidemic that seems to be getting worse, not better. That problem is real and it is very current. But the misogyny that motivates it is age-old. That's why I want to focus the remainder of my remarks today on 2 issues, one deeply historic and one contemporary, but linked by that common thread of misogyny. Before this Parliament right now is a petition demanding a pardon for the more than 4,000 people in Scotland, the vast majority of them women, accused and in many cases convicted and executed for being witches under the Witchcraft Act of 1563. Those who met this fate were not witches, they were people, and they were overwhelmingly women. At a time when women were not even allowed to speak as witnesses in a courtroom, they were accused and killed because they were poor, different, vulnerable, or in many cases, just because they were women. It was injustice on a colossal scale, driven at least in part by misogyny in its most literal sense, hatred of women. The pardon the petition calls for would require this Parliament to legislate, and in future this Parliament may choose to do so. But in the meantime, the petition also calls for an apology. After all, these accusations and executions were instigated and perpetrated by the state. And so today, on International Women's Day, as First Minister on behalf of the Scottish Government, I am choosing to acknowledge that egregious historic injustice and extend a formal posthumous apology to all those accused, convicted, vilified or executed under the Witchcraft Act 1563. Now, some will ask why this generation should say sorry for something that happened centuries ago, though it might actually be more pertinent to ask why it has taken so long. But for me, there are three reasons. Firstly, acknowledging injustice, no matter how historic, is important. This Parliament has issued, rightly so, formal apologies and pardons for the more recent historic injustices suffered by gay men and by minors. We're currently considering a request for a formal apology to women whose children were forcibly adopted. Reckoning with historic injustice is a vital part of building a better country. So too is recognising and writing into history what has been for too long erased, the experiences and the achievements of women. Second, for some, this is not yet historic. There are parts of our world where even today women and girls face persecution and sometimes death because they have been accused of witchcraft. And thirdly, fundamentally, while here in Scotland the Witchcraft Act may have been consigned to history a long time ago, the deep misogyny that motivated it has not. We live with that still. Today it expresses itself not in claims of witchcraft, but in everyday harassment, online rape threats and sexual violence.
Public campaigners, which also contained a quantity of modern-day practitioners of witchcraft, were thrilled to see the campaign be brought into the public eye, as they've been campaigning for a number of years to seek recognition of the atrocities and war on women, which, unlike many other battles, have been all but forgotten. The group, Witches of Scotland, have, along with gaining an official apology from the government, also been campaigning for an official monument to those executed for the then crime and an official pardon for any convictions made using the old Witchcraft Act. Just nipping in here to say that I just realised that the Witches of Scotland also have a podcast of their own, so make sure that you go and check that out. I'll pop the link in the description for you. A few different charities are still seeking planning permission for a monument to be placed in Fife, a place where many witch trials happened, and a suitable location has been found there, but no updates have been given since summer on the project. Fingers crossed they can get the go-ahead soon. Our next story today is not for anyone that suffers from pediophobia, a fear of dolls. So if that is the case, just skip ahead to our next story in a few minutes. In Rotherham in South Yorkshire, a couple were creeped out to watch their overnight security footage back to see something moving in their home. However, this wasn't any regular intruder, this was a doll. Lee and Lindsay Steer from Rotherham, South Yorkshire, are collectors of paranormal paraphernalia, and in particular, they have a penchant for purchasing the most lucrative of all eBay scams, haunted dolls. Lee and Lindsay have said they've been collecting paranormal items and the creepy children's toys for a while, and as they believe these items are very haunted and have a connection with the other side, they keep security cameras on them, particularly overnight, to capture any spooky goings-on. Now, in the footage, a room shows a wall full of dolls, but on the left-hand side at the bottom of the screen sits a larger doll. This almost life-size doll slowly dips forward and it looks as if it's going to fall, but then the movement becomes jerky and it turns its head to face towards the camera. It then stops in the forward slumping position, but it never falls from the shelf. All of the other dolls stay entirely still. Now, if you're listening to the podcast and you're not watching the video version of this, please pop over to YouTube because I'll show the 16-second clip so you can see what I'm talking about. Both Lee and Lindsay were quite spooked by the strange movement of the doll caught on camera, saying if it was a natural fall, it would have gone on the floor, but it didn't. The way she was positioned defies gravity. To add to the creepiness of it all, the Steers say that the doll in question was just left randomly outside their house one day, and so they took it in. That might sound weird out of context, but it's not unusual for this to happen to the couple. They run the Haunted Objects Museum in Rotherham, which, from what I can tell, currently has closed down and left a ghost of a Google page behind. So a random haunted drop and run parcel isn't such a strange thing for them to happen across. But of course, You know me, I had to do a bit of delving to find out what was going on here, and we have another story from November this year saying that they own an Annabelle doll. You know, the one which was the doll from The Conjuring, the patchwork-looking thing, not the terrifying child ghost they turned it into in the films. And the Annabelle doll has been causing them some troubles too, swearing and moving and generally being possessed. As it turns out, they also have a ghost hunting company called Ghosts of Britain, and their Facebook page is awash with all sorts of paranormal proof. And I use that term in inverted commas. So what do we reckon on this one? Do we think it's a true bit of paranormal activity, just gravity, or a hoax? Let me know your thoughts. So on to our next story now, which sees a decades-old mystery solved. Now, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but if you are into strange and spooky things, which, let's face it, I know you are, you may have already heard of the Dyatlov Pass Incident already. But for anyone that hasn't, let me just summarise it very quickly for you. On February the 2nd, 1959, in Russia, 9 skiers who were led by their leader, Dyatlov, died near their camp next to the Ortorten mountain. By the 26th of February, their deserted campsite was discovered by a rescue team that had been sent to find the missing people. What the rescuers found was a very confusing scene. 2 of the skiers were found about a mile away from the campsite by a tree line, but stranger still, both of them were only wearing their underwear. 3 other bodies were then found somewhere between the camp and the tree line. The 5 bodies were all given the same cause of death, hypothermia, but one of the people found in the group of 3 had a fractured skull. The other 4 people still remained missing. Fast forward 2 months and the bodies of the remaining 4 lost people were recovered. They had sustained some interesting injuries. 2 had fractured ribs, 1 had a fractured skull, and 1 of the women in the group was missing a tongue. The 4 bodies were also wearing between them the clothes of the 2 bodies that were left in their underwear. The campsite was also shown to have been completely decimated, and it's thought that their tent was ripped open, but from the inside. The bodies that were recovered also showed levels of radiation. At some point, I promise I'll cover this one in full, as it's a really interesting and unsettling story. The mystery of what happened to the individuals on the Dyatlov Pass incident has remained a mystery, but experts think they've now managed to solve it and finally work out exactly what happened to the frozen men and women. In 2019, a re-investigation of the case was started. Investigators used photography mapping techniques to work out the location of the skiers' original campsite, which was a bit further away than previously estimated. They then looked at historical weather records for the evening and simulated the tent's position and very high winds, which would have made snow flurries. What they worked out was, in order to try and protect themselves, the skiers had dug into the snow to build a small wall in order to make sure their tent was secure from the buffering winds. What the group hadn't realised is that the fresh snowfall was loose and susceptible to slide, and digging into the snow had just weakened the freshly fallen powder. As they slept and more snow fell, this just created a super tall bank of snow, which then toppled and crushed the tent below. The weight of the snow would have been so immense that it would have crushed people, and the injuries reported on the bodies of broken ribs and fractured skulls explain that theory. The cutting from the inside of the tent also makes sense, and the scattering of the bodies lines up with people thinking that they were about to be crushed by an even bigger avalanche. So running downhill, trying to escape the snow and heading into the trees was a smart idea. It wouldn't save them from an avalanche, but it would disrupt the snowdrift somewhat and offer their best chance of survival. As the snowfall had happened quickly, there had been no time to grab much needed supplies, and so failing to stay warm, the group had to make a fire down at the tree line. It's thought that's where the first 2 of the group died, as they succumbed to hypothermia. The others in the group then must have repurposed the clothes of their deceased friends in an attempt to stay warm. In a desperate bid to get themselves back to safety, 3 of the group, despite their fears of an avalanche, headed back up the mountain to try and get much needed supplies, but they too must have succumbed to hypothermia before reaching the camp due to the severe cold winds. Now for our final 4. They did seemingly survive a little longer, digging themselves a snow shelter, but as if they'd not already been through enough, the snow shelter fell through into a stream which was running underneath the snow, and this buried them, where they inadvertently died in their own improvised snow coffin. When their snow-covered carcasses were fragrant enough after a few weeks in the snow, scavengers such as bears and wolves would have discovered the corpses, which explains the missing tongue, as animals tend to go for the soft bits first. And then, finally, why were the bodies radioactive? Well, as it turns out, the town which the skiers had come from and the surrounding area were affected by radiation after a nuclear incident near there. This meant that the bodies would have had residual radiation on their personal items, but also as a result of living in such a highly contaminated zone. So there we have it. A decades-old mystery has been solved in 2022. However, what we have to remember is that this is still a theory. It's not definitive proof, and after all, the only people who do know what happened were tragically killed, but for the time being, this seems like the most plausible story we're going to get anytime soon. Thanks for joining me for that selection of weird stories. I hope you enjoyed them, and if you did, there will be more along soon, so please make sure you're subscribed if you're not already to keep up with the series. If you're liking this little mini-series and what I make in general, and you want it to continue and for me to make more things, then please consider becoming a Patreon supporter like our executive Patreon producers Amy, Christina, Jess, Kate, Kevin, Mary, Sally, Sam, Sarah and Veronica. And huge thanks to all my other patrons too. Seeing as we're now getting into the Christmas season, if you want to send a little tip to say thank you or purchase a gift from my Amazon wishlist, I would massively and hugely appreciate that too, and I'll leave all the links in the show notes. If I've not said it before, all of the support goes directly back into making the show. An enormous thank you for even considering doing any of those things, as it means the absolute world, and I hugely, massively appreciate it. And if you're part of that gang that's done any of those things recently, then thank you very much. Thank you for joining me. I've been Nikki Druce, and I will see you ghouls next time for April.